princess, you notice. Or a charioteer, or something of this sort. It's as real to them as the rest of their pathetic lives are. But it's subjective, and it's wish-fulfilling, and it doesn't count. I'm actually a bit amazed we haven't got to wish fulfillment yet. Could I say a word about
Sure.
that? I mean, Freud, in his Future of an Illusion, says that the connection between our desires and our beliefs in the case of the afterlife is so obvious. It's mankind's oldest and most strong dread. Maybe we could duck the fate that appears to be in store for us. That it's unlike any belief that Sam and I can offer you. Maybe all kinds of discrepancies between scientific views. We cannot promise you things of this kind, as religion always has to people. It doesn't make us morally superior, but it does mean, and we're not particularly happy with what we propose, which is overwhelmingly likely that annihilation and extinction await us. It's just that the overwhelming weight of evidence seems that way. Now, again, to quote Dinesh, he said to me once, well, I can see why people want heaven for themselves, and that's wish-fulfilling, and eternal life, even though I think that's a horrible idea myself, but still. But why do they want hell? Why would a wish-fulfiller invent the inferno? Well, I think that's pretty obvious. It's for other people to go to. A very old rhyme among English Calvinists was, we are the pure and chosen few, and all the rest are damned. There's room enough in hell for you. We don't want heaven crammed. In fact, in the work of many early church fathers, I'm so glad to find, by the way, that anything written in the first century by religious people doesn't count. And I wish that more ministers of religion would make that concession. You know, but Tertullian and many other Christian fathers thought that one of the pleasures of heaven, because it's always been rather hard to describe them, you ever noticed that? Eating foie gras to the sound of trumpets was the Reverend Sidney Smith's best shot. We know what the Muslims think for men. Apparently for women, do you know what they get? They get their husbands back.
Is that heaven?
Nothing man-made about that, right? But the church, at least the Christian church, said no. One of the pleasures of paradise is surveying and relishing the torments of the damned. When we talk about wish fulfillment, we're talking about the very unpleasant primate species to which we belong, and the self-interested fantasies that it will continue to generate. One of which is religion.
Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead, Brad.
Two things to say here. The first, I need to confess to the audience. My mother, the atheist, the Freudian psychoanalyst atheist, wants me to tell you that she's rooting for you guys. And the two can play at that kind of clever and cute trick. You know, so you've confessed that the idea of an afterlife is a hideous idea. Well, of course there's a wish fulfillment involved in hoping that we're not accountable and that at the end it's all over. So one can pathologize the other viewpoint, but it's unworthy of you. It seems to me that the test in Jewish tradition is not another person's theology, but their behavior. And that unethical behavior is to be condemned, even if it comes from a good atheist, just as it is to be condemned by someone who claims to cloak it in religious rhetoric. So here's the last religious thing I want to say. At the very core of traditional Judaism is the notion of bechira, of choice, which means no miracle is so unambiguous that it can't be explained away as secular, and no miracle is so overwhelming that you have to accept it. So you have a perfect example of that. We have this data that suggests that the mind has a far greater range than we have previously admitted that it has. My autistic son is capable of hearing through walls. He'll listen in school to 2 classrooms down, and accurately, we've checked, report what that teacher was saying when his teacher was too boring to listen to. Don't we all wish our brains could do that? And so the expanse of the mind is far beyond what we have described it as being capable of being. So one can look at this data and say, this looks to me like intimations that we do in some key and important way have consciousness that is mediated through our minds, but is not limited to our brains. And then it's equally plausible to say, until you're dead, you have no business talking about it. It does feel to me that the irrelevant aspect of this, and the Freudian in me looks at the animus here and says that's what needs to be accounted for, is that for many of us, hope in an afterlife grounds us and gives us direction. And the notion that my grandmother and I are not eternally separate is a source of great and abiding comfort to me.
Do you believe you'll see her?
If by see you want me to walk into something literal
Well, you just
again,
said you're not eternally separate. I don't know what you mean.
I'm using a metaphor because I think we are packets of energy. Look, I get that from physics as well. We are packets of energy, and I don't think those packets of energy are necessarily limited to our body. And the last thing I have to say, just to clear my reputation here, at no point did I say that first century literature was irrelevant. What I said is it's not meant to be taken literally.
I want to piggyback on what Brad said.
That's not what it said.
We've gone around this several times. Almost every time that Christopher and I have debated, which is now several times, I've made this same point, but obviously to no effect. So either the point is not good or the point is not good. But I want to make it anyway. Listen, when someone explains their own beliefs by reason and explains your belief by psychology, you actually don't have to listen to them. Because this is what happens to religious people all the time. I'm an atheist because I'm strong and rational and thoughtful. You're about wish fulfillment. And therefore, religious people are by definition weaker, less sophisticated. We understand, you shouldn't be religious, but I understand you need it. There are people who believe in the afterlife who are weak and fearful, and people who believe in the afterlife who are courageous and strong. There are atheists who are weak and fearful. There are atheists who are courageous and strong. It is an unworthy argument to say that someone believes in something because of wish fulfillment as opposed to someone believes in something because it makes sense or it doesn't make sense. That's not the way you ought to argue about religion or anything else.
Bradley just said that his belief in an afterlife is predicated on the effect this belief has in his life. It gives him hope. He finds it immensely consoling.
Is that why you believe in the afterlife? I'm just curious.
No, but it is one of the benefits of it.
Okay,
right.
so
it has a consequence, but that doesn't mean that that's what... Look, I find it enormously consoling and wonderful to think that my daughter loves me. But I don't believe it because I find it enormously consoling. I believe it because she does.
Okay.
She's a teenager.
You do, right? Okay, just a little empirical verification there.
I mean, there's a false assumption about science operating here. Science is not in principle committed to the idea that there's no afterlife or that the mind is identical to the brain,
right, or
that materialism is true. Science is completely open to whatever in fact is true. And if it's true that the consciousness is being run like software on the brain and can, by virtue of ectoplasm or something else we don't understand, can be dissociated from the brain at death, that would be part of our growing scientific understanding of the world if we could discover it. Now, and there are ways we could in fact discover that if it were true. The problem is there are very good reasons to think it's not true. And we know this from now 150 years of neurology where you damage areas of the brain and faculties are lost. And they're clearly, it's not that everyone with brain damage has their soul perfectly intact. They just can't get the words out. Everything about your mind can be damaged by damaging the brain. You can cease to recognize faces. You can cease to know the names of animals, but you still know the names of tools. I mean, the fragmentation in the way in which our mind is parcellated at the level of the brain is not at all intuitive, and there's a lot known about it. And what we're being asked to consider is that you damage one part of the brain and the mind, something about the mind and subjectivity is lost. You damage another and yet more is lost. And yet if you damage the whole thing at death, we can rise off the brain with all our faculties intact, recognizing grandma and speaking English. Now,
David?
And I think a much more important point is if everything you're saying about your religious orientation is true, because you're basically confessing a kind of scientific attitude toward the mysteries of subjectivity and what happens after death, then the usefulness of holding to these traditions and these first century books is I'm completely at a loss. I mean, it seems like you're in the wrong line of work. You should be psychology.
And I'm sorry to say, David, that your shorthand account of our disagreement is a little
Self-serving?
a little deceptive. I mean, if you say to me of yourself that the fact that I hold a belief that makes me feel better has nothing to do with why I hold the belief, I might just believe it from you, I suppose. But Freud isn't as crude as you make him sound. He said that to ask people to accept that humanity's oldest fear, that of death, and oldest wish, that of the ability to survive it, has nothing to do with the faith in an afterlife. It's only a coincidence if it makes people feel better. I'm not going to accept that, and you shouldn't be putting it about either. Yeah.
David, you didn't get a chance to respond to the near-death. Does that have any impact on your beliefs?
Well, I'll just say this about near-death experiences. First of all, I would love, well, I wouldn't like to have one, but I'd love to have one. And I've been operated on several times with the sad result of having nothing other than unconsciousness during the operation. But 8 million people have reported these near-death experiences, according to a Gallup poll in '92, so presumably others have had it since then. The sort of William James pragmatic test of whether an experience is real is that, in fact, many of them report that they no longer fear death, that their lives have radically changed as a result of it. And the only thing I would say is, do I say that this is proof that there's an afterlife? My answer is no, but. And here's the but. There's this philosopher named Jackson, I think Fred Jackson, who proposed the following experiment. Dennett's commented on it. I don't know if either of you have, but I'd be curious to know what you think. He said, look, let's say you had a brilliant scientist in a room with a black and white television in a black and white room, and the only thing she ever saw was black and white. And she became the world's expert. Her name is Mary in his experiment. She became the world's expert on the physiology of vision. She knew everything about vision, about the neuroscience of vision, about the way the retina works and so on. She knew as much as it is possible to be known. Now, he said, imagine that you turn on the television and it's in color. Has she learned something? In other words, is there something you learn from experience that is not reducible to intellection? And my sense is, yes, she would have learned something if all of a sudden she saw colors that she could not have known if she was an expert in the neuroscience of color. Someone who has a near-death experience is saying to us, I actually learned something from the experience that you can't reduce to this is some kind of trick that we don't understand yet that your brain did. I'm not willing to say that it's proof of the afterlife, but I'm also not willing to dismiss it with a few laughs and say that all the millions of people who've had this experience and have felt that it gave them important information about life are wrong and foolish.
How does the 8 billion stack up against the people who've been inseminated by UFOs or their pilots?
Well, I think there's probably some overlap.
Or the many.
Let me tell you something.
Or the many.
I don't know.
It's certainly nothing compared to those who've seen the Virgin Mary's statues move or bleed. Nothing like.
But does that mean you believe that they, in fact, didn't have such an experience? Is that what you're saying?
No, those experiences are real to me, to them. All I ask is that they keep it to themselves if they possibly can. No, I mean, I knew very well a man named Hugh Montefiore, who was one of the only 2 Jewish boys at an English boarding school, until one day Jesus of Nazareth came into his room and said, "Follow me." which he did for the rest of his life. He ended up as a very senior member of the Church of England, a bishop, in fact. In fact, the Bishop of Birmingham, which, by the way, is the first line of a limerick. And acted throughout as if that was as real to him as anything could be, and wrote some very interesting books indeed. And terribly upset the only other Jewish boy in that school who was left as the only other Jew. But yes, of course I have to grant that these things are real to him. I'm not sure I believe that the mass visions of weeping and bleeding statues are as real. I think there's a lot of collective hallucination.
Right. Well,
and if you ask people to draw what the Virgin looks like when they've only had a vision of her, it's always like the last icon that they saw.
I'm not saying that we should fall down every time terracotta gets wet. I mean, that's not my statement here, and I don't believe in weeping statues. But you anthologized two of these experiences. It's just that people gave them different interpretations of them. So I have to think that you actually take these experiences seriously. There's nothing in The Portable Atheist about visions of the Virgin Mary crying, but you put Ayer and Dennett's experience in there. They didn't necessarily think that it proved something about the afterlife, but you must have credited the experiences enough to put it in your book.
Well, sure, because anything that suggests that people are having... NDEs are pretty new, and so are a large number of medical and life-prolonging techniques. I think that's interesting enough in itself. That people can now live long enough or be well-tended enough to have experiences of consciousness that we haven't even begun to study yet. That of course deserves to be taken seriously. But the people who say, oh, all that does is not really new, all it proves is what we already knew from the first vision or from the first promise of the divine, are doing what religion always does, assimilating what they can of the discoveries that would otherwise make nonsense of it.
It occurs to me as you're both talking that both of you have faced serious illness in your lives, and I'm wondering if that at all has shaped your view of the afterlife. David?
I actually don't think so, no. It neither mitigated my terror, nor did it, I think, reinforce my faith. I think that although I changed as a person, I don't think that I changed, at least I hope I changed as a person. I don't think I changed belief or the sense that people were more than stuff.
Christopher?
I would say it fractionally increases my contempt for the false consolation element of religion and my dislike for the dictatorial and totalitarian part of it. But I presume what I say by the first is self-evident. But what I mean by the second is it's considered perfectly normal in this society to approach dying people who you don't know, but who are unbelievers, and say, now are you going to change your mind? In fact, it's considered almost a polite question. And as you know, there's a long history of fraud about this. People claim that Darwin had a deathbed recantation. They'd made up lies about Thomas Paine. It goes on all the time. It's a very nasty little history, but there's also a horrible undertone of blackmail to it. People write and say, look, you've got about one chance left now. Aren't you going to take it? I'm writing to you as a friend. They've even tried it on me when I've been very ill and I haven't had quite the vinegar I'd like to have had in a hospital bed. I don't mind, I can take it. But I think there are a lot of people older than myself, iller than myself, perhaps at the risk of seeming conceited, less educated than myself, to whom that's a horrible experience. It's very depressing and alarming to be spoken to in that way. I mean, if Sam and I were to form a corps of people to go around religious hospitals, which is what happens in reverse, and say to people who are lying in pain, say, did you say you were Catholic? Yes. Well, look, you may only have a few days left, but you don't have to live them as a serf, you know. Just recognize that was all bullshit, that the priests have been cheating you. And I guarantee you'll feel better. I don't think that would be very ethical.
Okay, but
I think it would be something of a breach of taste. But if it's in the name of if it's in the name of God, it has a social license. Well, fuck that, is what I say. And will say, if it's my last breath. Thank you.